So with that, let me just introduce you all to the theme of tonight's America's Public Forum. Just by a raise of hands, who here had heard of Gertrude Himmelfarb's work before you saw that we were doing this event tonight? I'm sure some have. I'm sure plenty have, actually. Yeah, so it looks like this audience is somewhat familiar with her. So Gertrude Himmelfarb was a great thinker in the 20th century who wrote a lot of books about various aspects of philosophy and political thought and virtue culture in Victorian England, and of some of their relevance to 20th century America and just to world culture more broadly. And she was a very influential intellectual then, and has in some ways been a very influential intellectual even unto nowadays. In terms of how especially a lot of conservative folk think about various questions of political culture and intellectual history, but she's even been just an influential historian on her own right. And so we are obviously indebted to many great historians, but I think her work on the ways that individual virtue, right, and the way the sense of public culture and the way individual virtue and public culture affect political systems, and maybe even to some degree have influence over the political fate of nations themselves. I think there's something really interesting in there. And we of Braver Angels, of course, have always been very gung-ho about the idea that the way we citizens treat each other, the way we citizens view politics ourselves, is important not just for our own lives, but for the life of our country, right? And so the work of Gertrude Himmelfarb is a useful guide in a lot of ways, but I think can be particularly interesting for depolarization folk, just as a reflection, right? And a way to think on what does this look like in other times and in other places. So we are joined tonight then by two folks who are eminently qualified to talk about this kind of work, and I'm excited to learn from them on both of these things. One of these folks is Gertrude Himmelfarb's son, Bill Kristol, who has been a noted intellectual and political commentator himself over the last several decades, and has done some amazing work in conservative world. And we're also joined by Lexi Hudson, who is the curator and main author of Civic Renaissance, who does conversations on a lot of things on these related subjects to various audiences, and brings these conversations to the fore. So without further ado, let me introduce Lexi Hudson to further introduce Bill and further introduce the subject of today. Lexi, wonderful to work with you.
Thanks, Luke. Really glad to be here, grateful to be here. I was excited to do this event because I remember when Gertrude Himmelfarb passed away, December 2019, I saw a number of these obituaries, and I had never heard of her. And they were written by people like David Brooks and Yuval Levin, people that I respect and admire. And they were really thoughtful, and I loved how they characterized her, and the kind of things that she wrote about are very similar to the things that I'm interested in and do write about and aspire to write about more. So I wanted to know more, and I started reading her work. And I really liked what I saw. So I wanted to share a few things that stood out to me about her work that I think make her a relevant thinker for our times, for our divided times, for our morally unmoored and ambiguous times. First of all, she brought the depth of the human experience to bear in her thinking. I think that's one of the gifts that people who study history have. They realize it kind of elevates your perspective from our current moment, and you can just bring a lot more to bear on our current moment. It's not just the here and the now. She also really didn't have an ideological axe to grind. I'd say she's broadly kind of dispositionally, maybe conservative, classically liberal, but I don't think that she wasn't someone that I could, pin down really. She really wrote a lot about a lot of things. And I did notice, you could just kind of see an evolution, not someone that just had, a few talking points that she wanted to stick to, or a few topics she wanted to stick to. I love the way that when she writes, she brings a wide variety of thinkers and examples and ideas to bear to make a point. I think our public discourse today, it seems so narrow, and there's so much media criticism. One bad op-ed published in the New York Times, gives commentators like weeks of fodder to like respond to and criticize and take down. And it just feels like it's a lot of navel gazing and a lot of like talking amongst ourselves and not like elevating. It's not, it just feels ephemeral. And we should be responding with great ideas and great thinkers like Gertrude Himmelfarb did. She had a holistic view of humanity and society. I really appreciated that. We weren't just mind, body, or spirit, but we were all of those things. We were moral, rational, physical. And she didn't romanticize any particular era or idea. She was very clear-sighted. And I think the study of history can offer that as well to us today. So those are a few ideas, things that I really, and there's so many more that I've really grown to admire about her, just reading through her work. And so I'm thrilled to have the authority on her work, a man who needs no introduction, a friend of mine for many years. I met Bill when I was a fellow, an intern kind of at the American Enterprise Institute. He had spoken to our class, and then I think I accosted him like at the entrance of the American Enterprise Institute and made sure he knew who I was, and we just kind of stayed in touch. And he's a very generous and kind person. So I'm really grateful to have you as a friend and mentor in my life, Bill, and thrilled to invite you to share about this person and aspect of your life that I don't think many people know about. People know you and you're known for things, but I want to give people a chance to get to know this important person to you, an important person objectively. So if you don't mind, Bill, can you open us up with a little bit of an overview about her life, biographical sketch, and things that about her characteristics, personality features that meant a lot to you?
Happy to, Lexi, and thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. And thank you, Luke, for helping to arrange this and manage this. And this is such a worthwhile enterprise in general that I'm happy to be a part of it for at least this evening. Yeah, maybe I'll say a word, just a few words about my mother's biography, since that I know that pretty well. I think her works honestly speak for themselves, and I don't think I'm the best person to judge them necessarily, because of course I read all of them and lived through the composition of many of them, and talked to, remember them coming out and getting reviewed. But in a way, I was too close. That maybe that makes you too close in a funny way. Someone like Lexi picking up the books for the first time, but reading them, intelligently and sympathetically, could in a way see different things probably than someone like me who, have so many layers by now of kind of years of knowing about them, and of course being her son and so forth. So I don't trust my judgment particularly. I don't think it's any better than anyone else's, honestly, in terms of her actual work. She was a historian, and I think it's the first thing to say, and intellectual historian mostly, though she wrote actually about policies in Victorian England, two very big books on the Victorian, how the Victorians thought about and acted to deal with poverty. So she wasn't entirely in the world of ideas, but that was her core. Mostly Victorian England, well, mostly England, Britain, mostly Victorian England, but then a lot about America and other things as well. I mean, originally she was going to write her thesis at Chicago on Robespierre, so she knew French history some, and she was interested in obviously, as most professors of history are, in more than just her own specialty, and very interested in America as well. And she wrote for a lot, first book I think is a dissertation, which I think she finished in Chicago in maybe 47, 48, something like that. And she wrote until, thank God, she was in good health into her 90s. And so she had, 70 years, 65, 70 years of writing. So wide variety of topics, changed her mind on many things, got interested in different things. Some of the stuff is probably a little stands up better than other parts. But I think an awful lot that's worth reading. I really, just looking back at it, trying to be somewhat objective, I think really a lot to be learned from it, I would say. And a lot to be learned, not just about the particular thinkers she wrote about, but a lot to be learned about how to think about ideas, in politics, how to think about history in a kind of open-minded way, in a non-formulaic way, and not trying to force these thinkers into boxes you've created, but trying to learn from these thinkers and appreciate them and appreciate very different thinkers. And she had a great ability, I think, to respect, conservatives and liberals and reactionaries and progressives and literary figures and much more political figures. She's quite sympathetic to a lot of the people she studied, which is good, because then you sort of take them seriously. You don't just, just writing a hit piece on someone. And so, and she lives obviously in New York first, and then Washington, and a very interesting intellectual milieu as well, along with my father. So her interest went beyond the kind of the normal ones, which are fine, but of a sort of professor of history, you know, in a university. She had a broader set of intellectual friends and acquaintances and things she read and kept up with. Just a word about her, just her biography, because I think it sheds some light maybe on her thinking. She grew up, born in 1922 in Brooklyn, daughter of immigrants. Went to public schools in Brooklyn and then to Brooklyn College. So very much of a kind of classic New York Jewish, you know, immigrant story. Her parents did okay. They worked hard. They were always able to provide for the kids, but very modest. I'd say working class, not poverty, but working class. And so that always stayed with her. I'd say a kind of appreciation. Lexi mentioned a kind of she always had an appreciation for the kind of virtues of common life. I would put it that way, maybe of the non-fancy virtues of hard work and integrity and loyalty. And I think she saw that in her own parents and her own relatives and the world she grew up in. And it wasn't one of these people who, you know, read about 19th century Britain and thought it was all very elegant and grand and wonderful. And if only we could go back to that. That was not her world. She understood what was impressive about 19th century Britain, and she appreciated the elegance and the grandeur of aspects of that civilization. But that wasn't really her own world, which was much more of a sort of hardworking immigrant world. So she had a great respect, I think, for immigrants, for hard work, for America, for welcoming them. And that stayed with her. And I think even when she was quite conservative on many political issues, that kind of experience gave her a little bit of a different attitude towards world events, towards immigration, but not just towards immigration, but towards people elsewhere. I mean, she didn't fall into the trap. She was very proud to be an American, very grateful to America. Didn't fall into the trap of looking down on other people, you know, there, but for the grace of God, we could have still been over in Ukraine and people, you know, engaged in some very messy civil war or something. And we didn't do anything to deserve being Americans, except my grandparents, you know, had the courage to come over here. But so I think that kind of cheap patriotism of looking down on other countries, she wasn't interested in that, though she was a very loyal and patriotic American. So that was, I'd say, one aspect of her, just her personality or character. She went to grad school at Chicago to study history while my father served in World War II. She got a scholarship. I think she may have been the first woman to get a PhD in history from Chicago, certainly one of the first. It wasn't very common. And that whole effort, I think, she didn't talk about that till later in life that much, but she enjoyed grad school. She loved it. She had wonderful teachers, had wonderful friends. She and Saul Bellow, the great novelist, were there together in Chicago and shared a rooming house. I mean, with 2 or 3 other people and some cheap, you know, digs in Hyde Park, because they were just all there. They had no money. They were in grad school. My father was away at the war, so my mom was alone. So she met all kinds of interesting people, very interesting time at the University of Chicago. So she was always very grateful for that. But I think living through World War II, my father off there, you know, was not in the first wave in Europe in 1944, but he had landed a few months after D-Day. So you never knew what was going to happen there. They had plenty of friends who were fighting on both fronts. They obviously watching what was happening in Europe with the Holocaust. I think it gave her a sense of the tragedy of life, the kind of unpredictability of life. Don't take things for granted. The fragility of civilization and of liberal democracy, certainly. The need to fight for things. It's sort of, she'd been a bit of a Marxist, a Trotskyite when she was very young, but I think all that experience really, she lost a kind of simple-minded belief in progress and everything will work out, or if we just make these 2 social fixes, you know, no one will ever hurt anyone anymore. You know, the world will just be a peaceful and sunny place. She was not very open to that, I would say, kind of utopianism of the left, nor the nostalgia of the right, because the old world was a world that her parents had left, and she didn't have much, you know, she wasn't sitting around wishing that if only those aristocrats in Russia were still in charge, that would have been great either, though. Probably better than the communists, but certainly better than the communists, but still. So I think she was free of a certain kind of conservative trap, which is kind of a, maybe you call it nostalgia, and of a liberal trap of kind of progressive utopianism, pretty hard-headed about the world, and appreciating, therefore, the fragility of civilization and of virtues and virtue, I would say. And finally, she then just became a historian. And I'd say her main experience as a historian in the first, few years, maybe a couple of decades of her work, and as I look back at it, was she was kind of contrarian. She sort of discovered things that others hadn't discovered. She discovered thinkers like Lord Acton, who were very much out of favor when she wrote her PhD thesis on him. She wrote originally, she was going to write on Robespierre in the French Revolution, who was in favor at that time, a lot of sort of quasi-Marxist historians around. And she decided she did not like that at all, thought that was a terrible warning of how a revolution can go horribly bad, as opposed to, let's say, the American Revolution, which was much more restrained and committed to political liberty. And she ended up writing really on Robespierre. But I think so. A lot of what she discovered in studying these thinkers and political actors with an open mind was that the historical conventional wisdom wasn't correct. I think she became a conservative more from that than from, reading conservative great works and necessarily believing every word of them. It was more of a reaction against what was dominant at her time, and maybe since, a kind of somewhat simple-minded liberal progressivism that disdained anyone who had doubts about progress, that disdained the complexities of the thought of a Burke or of a literary figure like T.S. Eliot and many, many others. So she was always attracted, I think, to she had complex views of complex figures. She wrote, actually, interestingly, this is rather unusual, she wrote a piece that was critical of Burke when she was young, of Edmund Burke, the great conservative thinker. We call him conservative today. He was he didn't call himself particularly conservative. He was a Whig, not a Tory, and a reformer, and a supporter of the American Revolution, but a great critic of the French Revolution. Anyway, she wrote a critical piece about Burke when she was young, which she revised, or didn't revise, she wrote a contrary piece about 15 years later. Sort of defense of Burke, and she's published both of them to kind of preserve the kind of, they're both legitimate points of view. And other thinkers, she had similar, I think, rethinkings of. So I think that was, her conservatism was less of a, I've read the following, 5 books, and therefore here's my doctrine and my dogma about how the world should work. It was more, I've looked at the world, I see it's a complicated place, I see the virtues, as Lexi said, of a kind of complicated but strong defense of liberal democracy, of liberty, of decency, of civility, of civilization, the fragility of that. And I respect these varieties of points of view and of efforts, which does lead you in a kind of conservative direction, in the sense that pluralism at least, and a kind of, lack of thinking that there's one person is right about everything and everyone else is wrong. So I think Pat Moynihan, who was a good friend of my parents, used to love to quote, I think it was Burckhardt, but some famous historian of 100 years before, that the great problem of modern times was the great simplifiers, and that a lot of people died because of the great simplifiers, and that we needed to have great complexifiers. And that was very much my mother's spirit, I'd say, the spirit in which she approached history. She could come to judgments. She wasn't one of those people who's just, on the one hand, on the other hand. But she wasn't, I think the judgments were guided by a kind of complicated, nuanced understanding of the thinkers that she studied. And so, her books are out, or probably in print, almost all of them, I think. If you wanted to begin with one, I would suggest The Moral Imagination, which, about 2006 maybe, which is a series of essays that she selected and rewrote, actually, a lot of them, which are really more appreciations. It's kind of her favorite thinkers and actors, I would say. Some of them somewhat contemporary, Lionel Trilling or Churchill, not quite contemporary, but others 19th century and 18th century. But she, these, I think they give a sense of what she thought was worthwhile and important. But a lot of other books, obviously, that you're free to read. As I say, I think what's good about them is you learn about whatever the topic is of the thinker, but you also learn about sort of how to think about politics and society more broadly.
Mm-hmm. That's one insight that I came to time and time again reading her work, Bill, was that she's a surprising writer. Like you don't really know where she's going to end up. You don't start reading something and you know exactly. I feel like so much today, pieces almost write themselves. You see the byline, you see the outlet, and you're like, okay, I know where this is going. But that's not the case with her, because I think you're right. Like she was evolving, and she had an inductive approach to the world, and like let what she learned lead her to conclusions about the world around her, and like let new evidence change her mind. Like that's a beautiful thing that we don't celebrate enough today, like changing your mind in light of new evidence. And I love what you said about how her study of history, going back to the sources, reading the same people that were popular during her moment, and saying, you know what, I think everyone's wrong. Everyone's got it completely wrong about this. And I think that just something that we talk a lot about at Civic Renaissance is the need to read great books and read the original sources. And this is part of the reason when you rely on secondary interpretations, that's someone else's lens, that's someone else's and maybe it's not totally wrong and skewed, but still like it robs you of the ability to come to your own conclusions, which is something that she did and had a lot of influence, like and changed how a generation of people thought about the French Revolution, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. I want to ask you really quickly before we get on to manners, morals, and history and all these fun topics that I love. How did your parents meet?
I'll answer that in a second, but I just want to emphasize the point you made. Yeah. It's a very good one about reading original sources or great books, parts of great books if you don't have time to read them all, and great books in translation if you can't read the original language, which obviously most of us can't do the way people maybe could have 100 years ago in all these different languages. But I mean, I was a student of Harvey Mansfield, who very much stresses this as a student of the philosopher Leo Strauss, the kind of, you got to read the books yourself and interpret them. She wasn't quite from that school, but she really, I think her own experience of reading secondhand accounts of all kinds of thinkers and actors, and then going back and reading them herself, was that you can't really trust these secondhand accounts often, especially if they're written by people who have a kind of other purpose in writing about them.
Yes.
Purpose. And also you learn more. And that's the main thing that she would say, I think, and that I would say, is it's not, you're not just reading these people to have like it's fine to read them a little bit and you get a kind of summary of their view and you can discuss it, that's fine. That's useful. It's better than nothing. But the main reason you read them is to see what how a great mind thinks or observes or analyzes, and to do it along with him or her. And, it's like reading a great novel, right? Someone could give you the plot of any novel of Tolstoy or Jane Austen or anyone like that. And, you don't need to bother reading the book, but of course, that's not really what you learn, right? Now, probably better if, in some case, to skim the book or know a little bit about the plot if you're not going to have time to read the book. But on the whole, you should try to read the books. And very much, I think that was her view of these great thinkers. And I think that would be something she'd really want to emphasize to people. Much better to read, 5 thinkers in the original, taking your time sort of carefully, than to read little summaries of 100 thinkers if you have the chance. My parents met, I think my father was maybe in college and she was in high school. I have to go back and relook at this again. They've written about it. My father wrote a little about it, but they were young Trotskyites. That is to say, they were followers of Leon Trotsky. So they were Marxists, but they were anti-Stalin. They knew that Stalin's Russia was horrible. Trotsky was in exile in Moscow. He was killed by Stalin's agents in 1940. So this is the very late 30s. And they met at some meeting of club. It was a discussion club, on Marx, or again, a million different Marxist thinkers they were all interested in back then. They both outgrew their Marxist phase pretty quickly. They were always anti-Stalinist, as I say, but they thought there was a better version of Marx. It just hadn't been implemented anywhere. I think one of the things she came to realize pretty quickly is that's not quite right. There are better and worse. Trotsky was not, didn't kill tens of millions of people like Stalin, but and they were much more peaceful Marxists and so forth. But that the doctrine itself had problems, and they both, my parents, by halfway through World War II, were more like liberals, kind of anti-fascist, anti-communist liberals, or centrists or moderates or something. And moved to the right over the years a little bit, but that was always their kind of core hostility to tyranny and to despotism, and suspicion of simple solutions. Maybe some of that suspicion came from being a Marxist, and sort of, I mean, Marx is very impressive when you read him when you're 16, and if you're in the middle of the Great Depression, and you know, and it looks like capitalism's failed, and it's blowing up all around the world, and degenerating in Germany into Nazism and so forth, or the way it looked. And you could talk yourself into a doctrine like that. And I think the lesson she learned from that is to beware of seductive doctrines like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a line from an essay that I'll send to Luke to have shared in the chat. It's on her the essay is, I think it might have been published in the Weekly Standard originally, your outlet, but I think it's now on the Washington Examiner website. It's called Revisiting Civil Society. And I came across it when I was reading some of her work in the wake of her passing. And this line, she says, that kind of segues our conversation into history and morals. She writes, "When we speak of the breakdown of the family, it's a moral breakdown we're talking about. And when we speak of the restoration of a civil society, it's a moral restoration we should seek. That restoration may actually take us outside the realm of civil society, for the mediating structures of civil society are themselves dependent on the well-being of the individuals who participate in them, and the state that protects and legitimizes them." I love that insight for so many reasons. One of the many reasons is that she had a conception of like society and institutions, even everything from, you know, government to civil society, they're comprised of individuals, and like hers was a world of like the individual, like moral imagination, you know, and I think that's and kind of localized the conversation. We speak in terms of like macro issues, polarization, social divides and breakdowns. But maybe we should be more talking about the individual, like the individual psyche, the individual soul, the individual moral conscience and imagination. So I wanted to kind of, I love that line. Luke, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to, it won't let me copy this link. So I'm going to email it to you and let you do it.
Lexi, I found it and put it in the chat.
Oh, thanks so much. Perfect. So I wanted to use that insight about kind of the individual moral level virtues and exercises of citizenship, like the individual practices, the habits of citizenship. Those sustain civil society, those sustain a liberal democracy, those sustain our political institutions. I'd like to unpack that a little bit with you, and where do you see that surface in her work, and why did that matter so much to her?
I mean, I think it matters, first of all, because the moral imagination is a phrase she loved, which I think Lionel Trilling used an awful lot, and which in turn, I think he takes from Burke originally. Maybe it goes before that. And I think, you know, part of that is from a distrust of a kind of Marxist or other kinds of accounts where if only we get all the economic stuff right, everything will be fine. People will be good. People will be decent. Civilization will be great. Or there's a kind of conservative version of that, you might say, of economic determinism. You know, a kind of, if just capitalism just can roar ahead, create a destruction, it'll all be for the better, and you don't have to worry about individual virtues to keep individuals happy, or
right.
keep families together, or keep society functioning. I think she was very suspicious of that, and wanted to say, no, look, at the end of the day, we all know this from common sense, right? If you're in a group of 100 people and they're all decent people with restraints and with civilized behavior, you're pretty safe. And if you're in a group of 100 people and 20 of them don't have any of those restraints and are thieves or crooks or worse, use violence and so forth, you need an awful lot of police forces and other institutions and, you know, TSA checkpoints for weapons and so forth to, you know, to keep yourself safe, right? So there's a kind of common sense version of that, I think, which I think she was very much struck by. And again, she had watched, and I think she was very struck by, again, that moral decency does not always correlate with intelligence, with learning, with advanced arts. You know, people of her generation were old enough to have grown up when Germany was by far the leading country in the world, really. Well, not by far, but probably the leading country in the world in art, music, culture. Maybe Britain was close, and France were close competitors. US was certainly behind, but it didn't stop Germany from becoming what it became. And so I think there was always a kind of appreciation of the importance of basic moral decency, individual responsibility. Having said that, she also, and this is I think the essay you're referring to is kind of complicated, but she had been a big champion of civil society.
Mm.
But then she also wanted to say, but look, I mean, you also do need a political structure. I mean, so to take our example, you still need some cops, you know, you can't count on everyone being great, and you still need a functioning country, even if you want to disperse power to localities as much as possible and decentralize. And you need a politics that works. And there are times when you need a political system that functions effectively, even if you hope to keep a lot of things out of politics and so forth. So, you know, she was not a libertarian in that way. I didn't think you could just reduce the state to a tiny little thing. She thought politics mattered. She very much admired kind of great politicians, great political leaders like Churchill, obviously, especially in crises, but even, you know, pretty good ones who weren't in that kind of crisis. She thought it made a big difference to have competent political leadership. She saw what New York was like, you know, in 2010. I didn't go back there much after that when she was already I was 90, but compared to when she left in the mid-late 80s, and it was kind of falling apart. And people in New York were mostly the same people. You know, they didn't suddenly change their character overnight. What changed was some of the rules of the game and economic development and policing and so forth. There were some problems with the policing, it turned out. But so, yeah, I think she had a good sense of the importance of morality and individual responsibility, but also a sense that we also should care a lot about the societies and institutions and structures around us.
Yes. So I think that her interest in the individual, I think that kind of gets at something that Braver Angels does so well with their work. Their whole vision of healing American public discourse, depolarizing America, is to put people who differ in contact with one another, who, you know, one votes Republican, another person votes Democrat. And it's so easy just to reduce the other to just that aspect of who they are, like who they happen to vote for or support in public office. Yet once you meet someone, once you converse with someone, you realize that there's so much more than that. There's so much more than just their, you know, their political affection on a given day, or their broader, you know, political disposition. We're complicated. We don't always have just, you know, rationales for things, and we are so much more than that. And that's another thing I really appreciate about your mother's work. Like I mentioned, she's surprising and wasn't all politics all the time. She kind of harkens back to this tradition of classical liberal and conservative writers that wrote about not just politics, they wrote about beauty. Like Burke has a whole treatise on the sublime, you know, like they had a vision of aesthetics. Like who's writing about beauty today? We had a Braver Angels conversation a few months ago on beauty, and could that heal our divides? Maybe even just giving us an outlet to talk about not politics. You know, Smith wrote a whole book on Adam Smith, you know, the father of capitalism, wrote a whole book on moral psychology and how we're moral beings. And people like Smith and Mill were incredibly surprising too, and you know had nuanced roles about the role of the state in education. And we're in this like reductionist oversimplification era where, you know, we just want what can fit in a tweet and what's black and white. And that's why hearkening back to people like your mother and the people she was dialoguing with, like some of the people I mentioned, is such a useful exercise. Just like remind us that there's so much more than the media criticism and the daily scandal that we're bombarded with every second of every day. And that, you know, taking an interest in all things human, like just the human condition, like that can elevate us, and that can, you know, make us more humble and realize the complexity of people and their motivations. And so it's something I've really enjoyed and appreciated about your mother's work. I'd love to.
The only, I mean, sort of caveat or the addition, added point I was making is, of course, we shouldn't be too assumed that in the past everything was so much wonder. You know, they were having long conversations. Right. A lot of that stuff was a lot of these thinkers were out of favor in their own time too, because their own times had radical simplifiers and had ideologues and people who didn't want to hear their arguments. So. And of course, a lot of their work is an objection to things in their time, right? Rebellion against their time. So it's a mistake. You're absolutely right about what you say. That's one of the great virtues of history, I think, and of reading thinkers from the past, is you get some perspective on your own time and you see its problems and limitations. Mm-hmm. You also see that we're not the only time that's had problems and limitations, and that's in a way encouraging, which means we can, in the spirit of what you're doing, in the spirit of what Luke's doing with and Braver Angels, we can do better. It's my mother was not a big believer in sort of, there was this wonderful moment and magic moment at some point, and then everything went down from ever for that. I mean, she understood history is much more complicated, somewhat cyclical, somewhat that after moments of apparent decadence, there are moments of revival, and a lot of that depends on individuals and on policies and on culture and sometimes religion. Religion can be a great force for good. It can be also not. So, I mean, it's I think having that kind of, but I do think, ultimately the kind of empowerment of people to take responsibility for their own, as much as they can, for their own fate, and to help out with the fate of their communities. I think that was something she cared a lot about.
I'd love to talk about the why of history for her. What drew her to history? I have a line here that I copied from, I pasted from, I think it might have been David Brooks's eulogy or reflection obituary of her in the Atlantic after she passed away. He writes, many academic historians now fall into interpreting the past in terms of the present, imposing the values of an enlightened and progressive present on a benighted and retrograde past. Gertrude Himmelfarb's own temptation, she wrote herself, was almost the opposite, to learn from the past what the present has forgotten. And I thought that was it's a beautiful line. One thing I like to say in my work is that history is both a caution and comfort. It's a caution because we realize just how bad things can get and have gotten. And, like a theme that you mentioned before, Bill, civilization is fragile and not a foregone conclusion. The rise and fall of empires, like we've seen that time and time again. And so it's comforting so it's cautionary, but also comforting. Like we've been here before, we've overcome it, and we can do it again. So I'd love to unpack with you what drew her to history. Why was she so invigorated by the study of the past, and what drew her especially to the Victorian period, England's Victorian period?
Yeah, that's a good question. For a second, maybe a little easier than the first. So on the Victorian period, she went to grad school. I think as I said, she planned to study the French Revolution. There's a famous historian of the French Revolution named Louis Gottschalk at Chicago in the 40s, and that's who she was going to study with. And I don't quite know how I think people knew about him at Brooklyn College, where she had been an undergraduate. This was a very different era, not a lot of, there weren't that many kids from Brooklyn College who went to the University of Chicago for grad school, but some teacher, I think at Brooklyn College, maybe had studied with Gottschalk and said, you should study with him. I think he probably wrote Gottschalk a letter and said, you should take this, this girl from Brooklyn College. And so she ended up there to study the French Revolution. As I say, she fell away from that. And I'm not sure exactly how she came then to Acton into that would have been late Victorian or even a little after the Victorians. No, late Victorian, but she, I think she really admired, this is World War II, right? So she admired Britain, which had, was obviously our great ally. And again, I think she always had this attitude. I talked with her about this. I just wrote a little thing about this because I was thinking about it in the context of, I don't know what, I guess maybe the 80th anniversary of 1940 and 1941 and all that, when Britain stood alone, she was old enough. She was 18 in 1940. She was old enough to remember when we were not in World War II. And it was very hard, in fact, to get the U.S. Public to understand that we had a stake there. And of course, you didn't get in until we were attacked in Pearl Harbor. So I'm thinking about this as a psychological thing. Hitler's running Germany. He says he's going to exterminate the Jews. You're a young Jewish student in New York or in Chicago. We didn't really have direct relatives there, but she of course had a huge amount of sympathy and empathy for there. And then Hitler invades France and Brussels and Netherlands and France. And then the Soviet Union's in alliance with Hitler. And then Britain's alone for a year until Hitler invades the Soviet. So I was writing about this because Hitler invaded just after the 80th anniversary of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. I think it's June 22nd, 1941. And I think that had a real impact on her, that Britain, there's something in British history had given them the strength to stand alone. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And with the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and of course Dunkirk before that, Churchill as prime minister coming back from the backbenches and from, being sort of looked down on by his own party, and a united government of Labour and Tories who hated each other, had hated each other for decades in Britain, and they stood alone for really a year. And then of course the Soviet Union's on their side once they get invaded, and that helps a lot because the Nazis throw a huge amount of personnel, obviously, to the east, and then obviously America comes in December and things change pretty radically. I think, I don't know, I never really talked to her about that, but I think the admiration for Britain partly comes from that, partly comes from the civilized character of their tradition and the fact that they had avoided most of the disasters of much of Europe over the preceding century or two in terms of horrible wars and revolutions and persecutions of other peoples. They weren't perfect, obviously, but different. A lot of what we got right, we sort of owed to the Anglo tradition, which became the Anglo-American tradition. So I think she admired that. And then I think she just admired a lot of the thinkers individually, whether it was Acton or Burke or Mill, or, she had a taste for some of those writers, their style and just the sort of, again, I think the wit, the civility, the kind of, I think she didn't, she's taught, she taught courses in Dutch history, she taught German, she taught French, obviously, she was very familiar with them. But I think the kind of lack of pretension, maybe, of the British, she also liked. So she always liked. She wasn't one of these Anglophiles who pretended to have a British accent or who had a sort of silly, slightly silly kind of Downton Abbey, worship of, the old houses of Britain. I mean, that's fine if people want to have that. That wasn't really her taste. I mean, it wasn't her thing. But she liked British murder mysteries. She liked British, she liked British literature, including, I mean, not great literature, but kind of current contemporary literature. I think the British civilization, it had a certain resonance with her for whatever reason. I mean, she was also interested in Jewish things, which is a very different track, obviously, and was knowledgeable about that too. And then, as I say, about other things as well in America too. But I think I do think for that generation, Trilling ahead of the generation, I think I mentioned, ahead of my mother and their peers, Britain really was special. It was the country that had been on the right side of both the big fights of our time, including ending slavery and then World War I, World War II. It was an admirable country. It's a country that had, God knows, had its problems, but had never degenerated in the way other places in Europe or the world had. So I think, Britain, I think that's why she became so interested in British history.
Thank you. So let's talk about manners and morals. This is something that she liked a lot, a theme that she liked and explored a lot. I read her book, The Demoralization of Society, From Victorian Manners to Modern Virtues, I think is the subtitle. And I'm interested in this topic. I'm writing a book about civility and civil society, and the Victorians had a lot of thoughts on both topics, on manners and morals, and she wrote about how. I guess I would say that she was concerned that our modern moment didn't have a moral vocabulary to talk about subtle moral issues. The Victorians, they drew a really tight connection between manners and morals. There was a line I really liked from The Demoralization of Society, where she wrote that civilities of private life were corollaries of civilized public life, and that appearances mattered, even if they didn't correlate perfectly with inner virtue, because they affirmed the legitimacy of Victorian values, thrift and honesty and things like that. So I'm really interested in this topic objectively, and I'd be curious your take on kind of that broader framework, especially your mother's take as well, and maybe also what we what we make of that today when we're in a moment that really prizes sometimes form over substance, doing and saying the right things, maybe without actually, being a good person or being a kind person. We're in an era where people are very critical of political correctness, or very sensitive about the right thing being said and done, when that's not necessarily, doing and saying the right thing isn't necessarily a perfect correlation with, actually caring or being a good person. And so just curious about what you think of that, how manner is not and kind of outer conduct, not a perfect proxy with inner character, how the Victorians thought about that, how your mom thought about that, and how we can think about that today.
I mean, that's such obviously a complicated subject. You've done a good job of laying out some of the questions. I mean, I just say, I think she would have stressed, maybe in responding to you, that, I mean, manner, I think what the point of that manners and morals is that it's not just morals. I mean, from Kant on, from Aristotle on, everyone understood morality is important, and if people, we have to think about how to educate people to be moral, or train them to be moral, religion and morality. That's not. I think my mother's sort of added point would have been, yes, that's all true, but people aren't all going to rationally make their way towards moral conclusions. And B, you can't count on everyone being fully moral, 24/7 all the time. And therefore, manners matter too, because manners can take care of some of the problems that where morality does. Just this is where civility comes in. Whatever you personally think about someone, however fine a person you might be at your deepest level, however good a husband or wife even you might be, it still matters if you're civil to strangers, if you have, this is where from the society's point of view, manners matter as well as moral, not as important as morals ultimately. But to use your phrase about form and substance, substance matters more than form, but form matters too. And form can sometimes take care of, people could really dislike someone else or have irrational prejudices. But you know what? If your forms are that you will treat everyone decently, whatever you think privately, whatever you think when you go home at night and maybe have bigoted views about race or ethnicity or religion, the truth is, what can we can't always control that. Maybe people had bad upbringings and whatever, bad experiences, and that's what they think. But if they're taught that you look in public, you need to treat people decently, you need to be respectful of people, well, that's matters a lot, right? I mean, whatever people think late at night is sort of hard to control, but the manners side of things matters as well. I was thinking of braver angels. That's a wonderful phrase from Lincoln, I guess, and the better angels, or playing off Lincoln, maybe the better angels are our nature and all that. But of course, the American tradition also is that men and women, I guess, aren't angels, right? I mean, this is Madison says this in the Federalist Papers. And so again, if you're not going to be if we could be angels, then we wouldn't need to have good manners in a sense. This would all be doing the right thing all the time, so no problem. Right. But since we're not angels, just a certain amount of civility and good manners really matters a lot. And I think she was struck. The British again had a real sense of that. All that kind of stuff you see in the, on Masterpiece Theater and stuff. All the formal behavior. There was a reason why they thought we're going to have a more civilized society if people kind of have to carry out these forms. The way in Congress people call each other the right honorable gentleman or gentlewoman, the way in the British Parliament there's a kind of formality to the system that can take the edge off some of the bitter disagreements that one has. It's not an accident that with the polarization and partisanship today has come rudeness and mean-spiritedness and vulgarity in discussing your opponents, right? And of course, ultimately, the problem has to do with deeper. But if you could fix even the outside, the external side of it, you'd be doing. You might have some effect on the way people, after you get used to treating people in a civilized way, maybe you rethink your prejudices or your hatreds. So I think that's sort of one aspect of our emphasis on manners as well as morals.
I love that. Okay, so really quickly, two stories from the Victorian Georgian era that I unpack in my book on civility. I have a chapter on integrity and this exact question about form and substance, outer conduct and inner virtue, and how they don't always correlate, but how they can reinforce one another. Orthodoxy leading to orthopraxy, orthopraxy leading to orthodoxy. So on one hand, we have Oscar Wilde's portrait of Dorian Gray, where we have this beautiful man who has, like, you know, the appearance of virtue, right? The historical association of beauty, goodness, and truth, the unity of those three traditional virtues. But of course, over time, we see his true inner character. His face stays beautiful, but his inner character is grotesque and monstrous, and that is depicted on the portrait of him over time that he eventually attacks because he hates being confronted with the ugliness of his character, and then dies. So that's you know, that story on one hand, where that disconnect between conduct and appearance, or character and appearance, ends that way. And a lesser known story is by a guy named Max Beerbaugh, who was responding to Oscar Wilde, and it's called The Happy Hypocrite. And it's about a man who's, you know, he's a womanizer and a gambler and a drunk, and he falls in love with a virtuous woman, love at first sight. And when he wants to marry this woman, she said, "I will only ever marry a man with a virtuous face." So he literally goes to a mask shop and buys a mask of a man with a virtuous face and, like, sews it on his face, then proposes, and they get married, and they're very happy. And he, over the course of their relationship, for the first few weeks, he's, you know, pretending to be virtuous. He's living up to the mask that he's literally sewed onto his face. Then a few weeks into his happy marriage, a woman from his past comes back and confronts him and says, you know, "You're not really who you claim to be. You're being a hypocrite." And yet he feels so bad that he goes to confess to his virtuous wife, and he goes to take off the mask, and his face, his actual face, had conformed to the virtuous mask, because he had been pretending to be virtuous for so long. His inner character and his external form had conformed to that. So I think that those two stories kind of tease out a number of tensions in you know, between the practice and inner belief, and orthodoxy, orthopraxy. And that reminds me of one thing that I really do admire about your mother. She didn't always offer, like, clear-cut answers, but she offered insights that helped readers who take the time to study her work the opportunity to think more clearly about ideas. And I think that's something that I aspire to as well, and really appreciate.
That's a wonderful story. You know, I never read Max Beerbaugh, and I guess I'd heard about that story, and I don't know that my mother had ever. I think she must have read it, but I don't remember her writing about it. She would have very much liked that story. She was very much on the side of that story.
Yeah.
You know, the one person I ever knew, I mean, I don't think he's read much anymore, who mentioned Max Beerbaugh, it was some weird context, but it sticks in my mind for some reason. I think we had a review in the Weekly Standard of a collection of his works. This would have been, I think, about 2000, or maybe republication of some of his works, maybe a biography, I don't know. And Pat Moynihan, whom I knew some, but I wasn't close to exactly, called me up. I mean, phone rang, you know, it was Pat Moynihan. Loved the review and said he'd always loved Max Beerbaugh, which is interesting. So the only other person other than you who's actually ever discussed Max Beerbaugh with me is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So you should be pleased that you're in good company, I think.
He has great taste.
He would have appreciated that. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay, so we're getting up to 9 p.m. We'd love to hear from all of you. So please raise your hands, and we want to incorporate your voice into the conversation and hear what you have to say. So let's go to Sarah Rickard. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say thanks for being here. I love Gertrude Himmelfarb's work, and it's a pleasure to hear you talk about her. So I have two questions. My first, sort of going off of this conversation that you've been having with Lexi about the conflict or the tension between, on the one hand, manners sort of affecting morals, but on the other hand, that not always necessarily being the case. I'm curious if you have a sense, either from your own perspective or from your mother's perspective, on the connection between that tension and sort of modern attempts at political correctness and the kind of extreme degree to which there is this moderation of speech. And it strikes me that there's some evidence that it's not always actually at all effective in getting people to change, but it rather sort of pushes people out of the conversation and pushes them away from being able to engage and really change their opinion. So I'm just curious to hear your reflections on that. And then if I could ask just a second short question, which is just, do you know what her favorite Victorian novel was?
So on the
maybe it's hard to
thank
pick
you,
one.
thank you for the kind words. So on the second, I mean, I think if I changed a little bit over time, she loved George Eliot, and she wrote a book about a short book near the end of her life about George Eliot, particularly maybe Daniel Deronda, because she was so interested in the Jewish subject matter of that book, which is kind of unusual when you think about it, by Eliot. On the other hand, when she was really quite, in her 90s and was sort of stopped writing, but was in good shape mentally and could read on the Kindle. It was easier for her eyes, She read a huge amount of Trollope. And she but she really liked Trollope. Maybe love's too strong. Didn't care she reread some Dickens, some Austen, all these other great writers, and they didn't quite speak to her the way Trollope did. And I've never really read much Trollope, but I mean, I think the conventional view, which I guess is correct, about Trollope is a kind of worldly, somewhat ironic view of life and of politics, of the church. He wrote these famous novels about set in the church, in the English, in the Anglican Church, and then he also about politics. He wrote about politics. So I think she liked Trollope's kind of sense of irony and distance, but kind of humane kind of understanding of people's limitations and their vices, which in a way gets back to the first, I guess question. No, my mother was, I think when she was a professor for about 20 years at Brooklyn College and City University, and she had many students who weren't conservative at all. And she was I always thought to be a very fair and open-minded professor and very encouraging of debate and discussion in the class. She really thought that was terribly important. So on the liberal education side of things, she would have been a very strong critic of political correctness, cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, from any side. She was very much a believer in a kind of more traditional liberal attitude towards ideas, especially in the academy, especially in colleges and universities. In the society as a whole, you could say, well, maybe there are, it's good to have some common opinions and some, kind of de facto, though not de jure, kind of consensus almost, that on certain things, maybe you wouldn't challenge everything in public and so forth if it disrupted the civic peace. But in terms of education, she was pretty very strong on the kind of a very strong critic of the notion that some people would be scared to say certain things, whether faculty or students. And I think she would have said what Tocqueville said. She was a big fan of Tocqueville too, that if you can't say certain things at some point, it's harder to think those things. And that, for me, that worries me the most. I mean, that if you're 19 years old and you're not exposed to certain arguments, and you think you might be punished if you even say them, maybe you keep them in your head and you just think them through anyway, but maybe you just decide, well, I guess I just put that out of my mind. And then your whole parts of intellectual life and history, intellectual history is sort of shut out to you. So she was a very big, she was not a friend of all these attempts to limit debate in the universities.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Bill, we have someone very special on the call. This is my father, Ned Vankovich, who has his hand raised. So Bill, can I introduce you to my father, Ned? Dad, can you unmute yourself if you want to ask a question? Your hand's raised. Do you have a question, Dad?
Yeah. Okay, I'm good. Yeah, thank you. Wonderful conversation. And I just got two questions. A simple one, would you mention that historian who talked about the great simplifiers and the great complexifiers? Do you remember, or does anyone know exactly where that's from?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was Jakob Burckhardt, who was a Swiss, I think, a Swiss-German historian of the Middle Ages mostly, at the turn of the century. But I think in an essay, not in his historical works on the Middle Ages, he has some essay about the 20th century, which is then beginning. So this is around 1900, where he says, I fear we are entering a age of the great simplifiers, something like that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful concept for today, I'll tell you that. All right, so here's my question. Several times you've mentioned liberal democracy, and you hinted at one core element regarding free speech and dissent and free thought. But how would your mother have defined liberal democracy? And then what would she say about what I see is to be the unraveling and demise of liberal democracy today. Can you speculate any on that?
I mean, I don't know. I think she would have had a fairly, normal, so to speak, definition. She was more of a historian than a kind of, moral philosopher who would have a kind of definition easily at hand, like John Rawls or Kant or something like that. But I think, a system where we elect people by the consent of the governed, where we respect people's rights, the kind of core declaration. The declaration says, all men are created equal, and therefore, what, two things, right? Government by consent of the governed, and that secures rights. I mean, that's really the two core elements of I think, liberal democratic government. And so one democratic, one liberal, if you want to think of it that way. Democratic, government by consent, people choose. Liberal, we respect basic rights and freedoms. And then you could have infinite debates about the welfare state and all that thing. She was pessimistic, as you seem to be, about about a lot of modern trends. But I think she also knew history well enough to know that pessimism can be wrong, just like optimism, and therefore, I mean, no one would have predicted in the 30s when he looked around at Britain that, they would rally the way they did in 1940, and people wouldn't have predicted before the Victorian period, actually, necessarily that Britain was up to what it was able to do in the 19th century. So there are a lot of ups and downs, in these historical epochs. And I think she would have been a, sort of pessimistic, but not, I think, deterministic, and very open to the notion that these things could reverse themselves with some leadership and some civic efforts.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing, I think she had a really strong understanding of the word liberal in the traditional sense. I mean, it's a kind of a word we've lost that sense, but liberal meant reflecting on what it means to be free. Like, that's what liberal education is. That's what liberal arts are. It's the education and the arts that teach us how to self-govern and to be truly free. That freedom begins and ends in the mind and in the spirit. And her very first essay in looking into the abyss is a lamentation of the demise of this sort of liberal learning and the sort of thinkers. It's a critique of Derrida and Nietzsche and the sort of postmodern deconstructionism that is antithetical to that mode of learning. So yeah, thanks for that question. Okay, Henry McHenry, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'm unmuted, I believe, here. My father loved Trollope as well, and I inherited a full leather-bound set.
Well,
I have not read them. And my question is, because reading is a solitary act. And my question is, what's available for civil society in face-to-face meetings between individuals? Huber called it encounter. That's not available in reading and writing or in the debate or the position statement. So does moral decency arise in reading and writing or in encounter? And if the latter, how do we make encounter available?
No, that's a very interesting question. And I suppose, you can read, maybe you can still get to the Trollope. I haven't read much either. They're pretty long, some of those books. Trollope got paid by the word. And I think he was famously, he did. And he outraged, scandalized people when he wrote an autobiography near the end of his life. And he said, he described his work habits. He got up at, early. He was a very hardworking guy. He had a job. So he got up at 4 or 5 a.m. and wrote for 4 hours, I think. And he wrote 1,200 words. I probably have the number wrong, but something like that, every day. And when he'd written his 1,200 words, he stopped. He had done his day's work. So, and this really outraged people, especially in the late 19th century. Everyone had a sort of romantic view of creation and inspiration. You had to sit around and be agonizing, and then they would all come to you and flow out. And Trollope, Dickens was like this too. They were very much, this is a job, and I'm going to serialize these books, and that's how I make my living. And I'm a craftsman, and just like a person would make a table in a very organized way, I'm going to make this book. So maybe that's a slight limitation on Trollope compared to a Dostoevsky type or something. But it's I think it's also maybe my mother sort of liked that kind of that attitude. I think you make a very good point about encounters. I mean, or and person to person encounters. That's, I think, one of the great things about America has been decentralization, which then allows people to, and requires them in a way, to get together to organize all kinds of neighborhood and community and civic activities. Of course, this is a famous thing that Tocqueville and many others have discussed. It's very much a characteristic of much of the settling of the West, but it's also a characteristic of New England. And you know, I went to vote in a primary a couple of weeks ago here in Virginia, and you really are struck even now. People volunteer to be election poll watchers and observers, and other people come out to give out, you know, leaflets for their party or candidate outside the polls. And, you know, all these people are either volunteering or being paid pretty nominal stipends to work pretty long days, actually, sitting there and checking everyone's address. And, you know, people get a little annoyed at you. Maybe there's something went wrong in the registration. So it's an impressive amount of civic activity. And it is one reason I've always been in favor of a very decentralization and bottom up sort of efforts. And, you know, you could have a more efficient system, conceivably, one giant computer, you know, and just we all could vote on our phones, I guess, right? And you know, these days they could make sure you weren't cheating or lying. Amazon makes sure that, you know, that you are who you are or whatever when you order something, more or less. And but you lose a lot without that kind of civic participation and neighborhood activity and local government. So I think that's, and of course, non-political activities as well. I mean, one of the great things, and this did come from England, some of this, the local theater, the volunteer thing, the activities, the fairs, and all these things that are very much, again, not, maybe they get a tiny bit of help from some level of government, you know, but it's not like the caricature, at least in France, where, you know, you don't just get together and put on a play for, you know, in your local neighborhood. You have to get the government either authorizes it or gives you a permit or it tells you what to do. And that's not quite fair, probably, but I do think that English and American tradition of local initiative is awfully important for building up people's character. They're willing, also their manners, because you get to, one of the great things, and this is maybe one reason we've gotten more polarized and partisan, is some decline of that, is that, you know, you have to get along with all these people. You work with them. You have to organize some local activities with them, the PTA and so forth. And you don't love them all, frankly. You don't agree with them all. And they're bringing up their kids maybe a little bit different than you are. But, you know, you kind of have to get along. So that's a very healthy lesson in democracy, you know, school of democracy. And one of the great strengths of the American tradition, that I think there is some concern that in an era of giant big government and giant corporations and high tech and Zoom, things like this, to some degree, we're losing some of that. On the other hand, I would say, when on the Zoom, the internet also gives you a chance to get some of that back, because we are having this conversation, right? Which we couldn't have in person. So I've always been less anti-technological progress than some of my conservative and traditional friends. You know, there are ways in which the internet makes it possible to meet all kinds of people and meet them in a real way, not in a sort of silly, you know, a hostile way or superficial way. And so I think a lot of the technological stuff is ambiguous in its effects, or two-sided. But I think thinking about what creates citizens who are active and who take responsibility for things and learn to work with other people, that's really a key part of politics, broadly speaking. It's much too little appreciated these days.
Mm-hmm. There is another way in which history can help us have perspective today. I mean, just looking at the way in which new technological developments in past eras have had destabilizing effects in society, promoted mistrust. The historical analog I like to come back to is the Gutenberg printing press. So that didn't exactly, that introduction into mass society wasn't seamless. There were peasants' revolts, there was a Protestant Reformation, there was 100 Years' War, you know, like that had serious ramifications. Net good, I mean, the printing press is, it democratized learning. It democratized, like the most printed thing was self-taught manuals on how to teach yourself to read. Like it promoted literacy and self-education. So absolutely net good, but serious destabilizing effects, serious mistrust in the Catholic Church and governing institutions. So I think having this healthy perspective of the duality of things, like often things are not just one way. The world tries to tell us it is, but often things, there are two sides to it. There's more nuance, more dualism. So okay, well, thank you, Henry McHenry. Jean Wisdom, that's a great last name. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Braver Angels, for putting this together. This has been awesome. I've been a fan of Gertrude Himmelfarb for a long time, and Bill Kristol, and also Irving Kristol. And I'm curious if Bill Kristol has any thoughts on or any perspective on the intellectual interplay between his mom and dad. They're both intellectual giants.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thank you for the kind words. And obviously that was fun to watch. I mean, I'd say they really, they were intellectuals, not of the kind you read about so much in novels sometimes, or see in movies even, but you know, they lived pretty normal, I'd say, lives in the sense that they had friends. My father was a big sports fan. They liked to read mystery novels as well as, you know, good literature, so to speak. My father worked in publishing for most of the time when I was home in middle school and high school, and that was a real job in New York. You know, he went to work, came home from work at 5:30 or 6, you know, and sort of had a drink sometimes and relax, you know. So it wasn't one of these, you know, sitting around being tortured intellectuals kind of thing. They had a lot of intellectual friends. They had a ton of magazines and books in the house. So, you know, it was a different probably than some people's upbringing. I think they were pretty different. So they had a lot of agreement, fundamental agreement on big issues. And even on smaller issues, they read each other's stuff and commented on it, but they were pretty different intellectually. My mother really was a serious scholar, I mean, a historian. And so, you know, some of the essays she wrote are more essayistic later in life, especially. But, you know, there's a ton of research. She did archival research. She went to Cambridge and looked at Acton's papers. That's why that was produced the PhD thesis. She read papers of Acton's that no one had looked at for 50 years. You know, she was a real professor and scholar in that way. My father was always an essayist, a magazine editor, and writer. Very different. Loved to kind of make provocative generalizations. My mother did that some, but she really liked also the kind of the detailed, you know, analysis of people's works. So they were quite different just in their intellectual style, I would say, though I think they had lots of tastes in common and lots of thinkers they both admired. And so it was you know, they were compatible intellectually and personally, obviously, a very long marriage, but somewhat different in their spirit. My father would always sort of slightly shock my mother by, you know, just making some wild generalization, not wild, but, you know, generalization that was often very intelligent and very perceptive, but probably if you had to look at it really closely, there were a lot of exceptions and it was an overstatement and you couldn't just have it, you know, he was so good at these short, you know, statements, paragraphs, 2 sentences, you know, encapsulating kind of an insight. And of course, if you're a serious historian or scholar, you sort of know the 5 reasons why it's not quite as simple as that. But he and my mother probably wouldn't have, therefore would have hesitated to make these bold statements that my father liked to make.
That's great. Maybe her love of history tempered her a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think
gave her a little bit of humility.
Right.
I love that. Thank you, Jean, for that question. Sarah Brooks, please, thank you for being here, and please ask us your question.
So first off, what I remember about your parents, Bill, is that your mother's voice was very soft and your father didn't hear so well in his later years, and that probably contributed to their compatibility. I want to return to the idea of moral education and offer a third corner to the Max Beerbaugh, where the mask reforms, versus the Dorian Gray, where the mask conceals, to a no mask story from the Mishnah, in which Rabban Gamliel was deposed from leading the Beit Midrash, but he had a policy that the outside of the person had to match the inside of the person in order to be accepted into the Beit Midrash. His successor, Rabbi Eliezer, said, no, everybody can come in. And my feeling has always been that the people who need to study this stuff, whether it's the Talmud or some other moral construct, is that if you're already perfect, what's the point? It's for the, you know, the people, those of us who are not perfect that need to study the moral education. And so I'm curious about what your mother would have thought about that.
Hi, Sarah. Good to hear from you. I think that's very true about my mother had a soft voice, and especially she got older and she was a small person, and my father was losing his hearing gradually, so that was always slightly comical moments, sometimes in the later years. My father used to go to, I'll just say one quick story. They used to go to lunch with various people, brunch or lunch at different times on Sundays. Once they moved to Washington, George Will and his wife, Mary, or Charles and Robbie Krauthammer, or were in Cedar Stells, or the various friends that arrange, very informal kind of hamburger place, brunch on Sunday morning. And sometimes those places can be kind of loud, as you know. And the last few years, my father, had trouble, if it was crowded, there were 6 people around a table, sort of always hearing everything. And I remember someone asked him after one of them, well, how much, he was kind of getting a little quieter the way people do when they get older sometimes. So, and part of it he didn't hear so well. So someone said, well, did you hear that exchange there? And my father said something about it. Well, he didn't hear all of it, but he made up what he thought the people should have said, and that was often better than actually hearing the actual exchange. So that was, I think, that was very much characteristic of my father. My mother would not have done that. She was very scrupulous about listening to the actual people, but my father would be happy to interpret what they would have meant to have said. I like your thing from the Midrash. No, Midrash. I mean, I think that's very. I think my mother would have been very much with you. She actually studied, as you know, I think she went to the Jewish Theological Seminary, rather unusually for a woman at her time, while she went to Brooklyn College. She actually got a degree. They didn't have, of course, women were not admitted into the rabbinate in conservative Judaism then, so you didn't get a rabbinical degree. You got something, I think it was called a Bachelor of Hebrew Arts or something like that. But this is kind of amazing. I mean, she was 17, 18 years old in college, 19. She lived in Brooklyn. She took the subway to the other end of Brooklyn, actually from Brooklyn College. She lived in Bensonhurst, if you know the geography of New York at all. And then took the subway, I don't know, 3 nights a week. I'm not sure how the JTS worked, but to the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is next to Columbia, to take classes there. I mean, she said she got all her work done on the subway. So that was very efficient, but it's sort of amazing when you think about the degree to which people went to take classes and learn things. So she was quite knowledgeable about Jewish things. She wasn't personally, I would say, devout or pious particularly, though she was attentive and respectful of the tradition. I think one thing she liked, and I'll generalize for your story in a broader way, one thing she liked about Judaism was a certain kind of democracy with a small of it, that there are rabbis who we look up to who know more than we do, and with their words get special weight. But the Talmud itself and the other books of the Jewish tradition are disputes among these rabbis, and many issues are left uncertain, unresolved. It's not clear who's right. Now there are also all these laws which you're supposed to observe, so I don't want to exaggerate how open the tradition is. You're supposed to do certain things, and the rabbis decided that this is the right answer, and not driving, I don't know, what you should do on the Sabbath and so forth. But she liked that sort of side of the Jewish tradition. I think that it's a very dispersed and diffuse tradition in a way. There's no church exactly. There's no pope, obviously. There's a book of everyone reads the Bible in synagogue, and then one reads some core prayers, and then there's a lot of arguments in the Jewish tradition, which is what people study. If you ever look at pictures of those of you who are Jewish, in movies, if you've seen these photos, these rabbinical students arguing about the text. They're arguing about the text, actually. They're not just memorizing it. So I think she liked very much that aspect of the Jewish tradition.
Sarah, thank you for that. Really quickly, what was that resource called? And if you don't mind, if there's a place that you could link to in the chat, that'd be wonderful. I'd love to look it up.
Well, I would suggest you go to Sepharia, which sepharia.org. That has the whole Talmud. The Talmud is like a commentary on a commentary on a commentary. And the story I'm telling is from the Mishnah, which is the oldest part of the Talmud. But if you just Googled, deposing Rabbi Gamliel, even in just Google, you would get the story.
Gamliel.
Yeah.
Gamliel.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Luke, we have your last question from our host tonight, our Brave Angels host. Luke, feel free to ask your question and then wind us down. Thank you.
Sure thing, Lexi. Thanks for that. Hey, Bill. So I have been recently re-imbibing the works of some of the mid-20th century consensus historians and mainstream liberals, folks like Peter Viereck and Clinton Rossiter and Reinhold Niebuhr especially. And so sometimes when I read brief reviews of your mother's work, I'm reminded of the different languages, I guess, they speak about things, but the similar conclusions about civility and consensus and I guess in Himmelfarb's words, reverence for a living tradition, and in Viereck's and other words, kind of being an unadjusted person in modernity. And so I've never seen in depth if she engaged with that particular group of thinkers very much, but I was wondering what you thought about the relationship of her work to some of the things that were being done by explicitly liberal thinkers in the 50s.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, so those thinkers whom I also have kind of gotten, I'm glad you're studying them because someone should, and they're kind of neglected and forgotten. And I've also myself gotten new respect for them in the last few years and looked at them a little bit, but not much. So they were a generation or two older than my parents, you know, so they would have maybe known them a little personally, but certainly known of them. So they certainly read them and were impressed with them. And Niebuhr was quite important for both my parents. He's such a major figure back in the late 40s, early 50s, and or through the 50s, I guess. And now I don't know how much he's read, but that kind of hard-headed liberalism. Look, you know, in Niebuhr's case, it was Christian, of course, but you know, we're all sinners, or we're all flawed. No system is perfect. But on the one hand, we can't go off the end, but we know what we don't want to be. We don't want to, and to wildly oversimplify, we don't want to be Nazis. We don't want to be, you know, racists. We don't want to be communists who are, you know, murdering people and classes of people in the name of some utopia that will never exist. We want to be hard-headed because there will be people who are dictators and who are seek to conquer others. And so that kind of hard-headed Cold War liberalism, I guess you'd call it, both abroad and at home, always was attracted to them. They were really part of that world. They were individually a little different from some of those thinkers, I think, maybe just because of different interests, different backgrounds, different traditions. That tradition did kind of fade out, I suppose you'd say, in the 60s and overtaken by other traditions, which were also important and useful in some ways. But Trilling, incidentally, I would say is very much part of, I mean, a more anguished literary type version of it, but very similar in his ultimate, I think, argument. Trilling's one novel. Trilling, I mean, I reread Trilling, Little Trilling. Well, that's when my mother died, but she is so fond of Trilling. I thought, well, maybe is she overdoing the Trilling? I'd read him years and years before. And it's pretty impressive when you read these Trilling essays on Jane Austen and T.S. Eliot and so forth. I mean, he was an awfully great literary critic, but he also wrote one novel. He wasn't a great novelist, I wouldn't say, but he was a good enough novelist, called The Middle of the Journey. And it is about the middle, you know, it's a defense of a kind of, it's based on sort of the Whittaker Chambers, Alger Hiss case in a vague way. And it's a defense of a kind of, look, there's a kind of communist utopianism that's praised, but that doesn't mean that we don't believe in liberty and justice, that we need to reject this kind of dictatorial side of it. I mean, it's very sophisticated kind of centrism in a way that's not just splitting the difference centrism. And I think they were sympathetic to that. And certainly when I felt, you know, started to study classical political philosophy a little bit, and it was sort of, was slightly not hostile to it all, but slightly just a little bit looked down a little on the liberal tradition. It's not quite good enough, you know. I remember my mother was saying to me at one point, look, it's not, may not be perfect, but it was pretty impressive in what it did politically and morally in terms of civil society. I had this conversation, I read John Dewey for the first time in a class at college in the early 70s. And he wasn't at the level, I didn't think, of some of the other thinkers we were reading in the 20th century, particularly Heidegger, who was a greater philosopher, I think it's safe to say, and Bergson and other, you know, much more interesting, exotic kind of thinkers from Europe mostly. Mostly politically nuts also, however. And I remember my mother saying at one point, when I said, I don't know, Dewey just doesn't really stand up against them. She said, look, you know, that may be true. And you've got to, of course, think these things through. You can't just say, well, I don't, you know, it's good enough for me kind of thing. If the greater thinker has real objections, you've got to think them through. But Dewey was an admirable person who stood up against both Stalin and Hitler as an elderly figure in the 30s. And some of his students like Sidney Hook were really fervent liberal anti-communists, but also anti-fascists. And that's a pretty admirable tradition. And maybe it wasn't as sophisticated philosophically as some of these other thinkers, but there's got to be something there that's worthwhile if you look at their behavior. So that was a useful caution to me. So very much in the spirit of what you're saying, I think. Yeah. So they were I think always sympathetic to that tradition, to some of those thinkers.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bill, for being here. Thanks.
No, my pleasure. I've really enjoyed this. So,
it's been so much fun. Thanks to all of you for spending your evening with us. Thanks to Luke for being facilitating it, and Elizabeth and the tech team for supporting it. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I hope we can have more like this about her. But I'm grateful. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk about some of these ideas that we don't have enough space for in our public discourse today. So thanks to all of you for being here and for making the time. And all of you who registered will get a link to the recording, I think. Is that right, Luke? This will be accessible so that those of you that were here can also share it with others that you think might enjoy it. It's for posterity. So thanks to everyone. Thank you to Bill and Luke. Any final thoughts or words?
Sure thing. Well, so the recording of this will be available on the Braver Angels YouTube channel by this weekend, so keep a lookout for that. Meantime, I just want to thank our wonderful partners over at Civic Renaissance. Lexi, you do all kinds of good work in this, and we appreciate working with you once a month for these. Everybody, if you don't already follow Lexi's newsletter at Civic Renaissance, it is excellent reading all the time, and it links you to even more events. Also, if you have not heard of Bill's program, Conversations with Bill Kristol, he has an exquisite taste in doing interviews with the most interesting people in policy thinking world these days. So you might want to take a look at that as well. We've put the links for those in the chat. Additionally, I'd like to thank Elizabeth Dahl and Dennis Smith, my two fellow Zoom managers behind here today. Braver Angels runs on the work of volunteers for the most part, and so it is always just great to be working with fellow folks here. So Elizabeth, Dennis, thank you guys for being here tonight. Anyways, just as a final pitch, I wanted to let everybody know that if you like what you saw here tonight, if you found any of the kinds of things we were discussing here of value, then I hope that does some testimony to something that we really deeply and strongly believe at Braver Angels, which is that there are certain virtues, there are certain concepts, there are certain ideas behind American politics that we can live in our practice of it, right? Things in like intellectual and philosophical ways, things in personal and private ways that make our polarized life, our contemporary modern politics a little bit better for ourselves, a little bit better for our interactions with each other. And the America's Public Forum program has been committed since it was set up, and will remain committed as long as I'm a part of it, to doing conversations with deep and interesting thinkers on that, to showcase all the different aspects of the American experience, all the different aspects of the ways these important questions of political thought and political practice relate to everybody's everyday lives. I certainly learned a lot in this conversation, and I will be excited to be working with you folks and with many more over time as we get stuff going. So with that, the link to Braver Angels is in the chat. If you would be interested in following us, you can subscribe to our newsletter there. There are America's Public Forums at least every Wednesday night, and sometimes during the daytimes as well. We are always looking for more events to do, and we're always even looking for more volunteers to work with. So if you would like to be a part of this work, we look at you with open arms, and we're excited to be working with you. So with that, everybody, thank you for spending your Wednesday night with us and talking about some of the most interesting work of the last century in its applications for this century and beyond. And I will look forward to seeing many of you on future America's Public Forum events. Lexi, thanks very much. Bill, thanks very much. And everybody else, let's move forward and build a house united. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, Luke. Bye, Bill. Bye, everyone.